Hall of Fame driver Bug Stevens used to deflect credit for all his success by saying, "I'm just a jockey. The mechanics, they're the real stars." That was partly just Bugsy being modest, but it was also his way of acknowledging a universal truth, that no driver can do much without a great race car beneath them. Our next inductee built great race cars, all right, and man, did they ever win. Mechanical work came easily to Dave Tourigny. He started tinkering with modified coupes in the late 50s alongside Rhode Island car owner Ralph Scotland. A 4-year stretch in the Air Force interrupted all that fun, but when he was discharged in the mid-60s, Dave was again traveling to local tracks with the familiar Scotty's 99. Most of us know him as the quiet force behind the gleaming white modifieds fielded by Hall of Fame car owner Sonny Casella and his wife Henriette, both of whom are with us today. Dave got together with the Casellas at the tail end of the 60s, and the combination was magical. The first two cars Tourigny welded up for the Casellas, a coupe and a Corvair, were driven by Leo Cleary. Then the 70s dawned, and there came another coupe and a Vega. This was the start of the best years for the Casella 15 and for Dave. To truly absorb what Tourigny's handiwork did across the 70s, just thumb through the record books. The victories and the championships leap off the pages. In 1970, the 15 Coupe, driven by Fred DeCero, won the NASCAR National Modified title. In 1971, with Bugsy Stevens, it won the Stafford Motor Speedway Track Championship. In '72, Bugsy won twice at Martinsville, a 250-lapper in March and a 100-lapper in April. 1973, by now steering a Vega, Bugsy won the Coca-Cola 200 at Pocono. In '74, the 15 won the Dogwood 500 at Martinsville. Closer to home at Stafford, Bugsy drove it to victories in both the Spring Sizzler and the Labor Day 200, and along the way clinched another track championship. In 1975, there was a return visit to Victory Lane at Martinsville in the Dogwood 500. 1977, Tourigny and the Casellas unveiled a rocket ship in the form of a Pinto, powered by a small block Ford, a rarity in a sea of Chevrolets. It won 7 features with Bugsy that year at Stafford, including 4 in a row. That October, in the Cardinal 500 at Martinsville, Bugsy lapped the field twice. That's just a sampling. Between all those major wins came scores of victories all over New England, New York, and Long Island. Bear in mind that by the end of that stretch, the modifieds Dave Tourigny was building were nothing like those he'd started with. The early coupes ran on stock frames and carried parts you'd find at the local Napa store. By the 70s, every piece on a typical modified, from clutches to brakes to shocks, was a high-tech aftermarket item. As Dave says, in racing, if you don't keep up, you get left behind real quick. Dave never got left behind. In fact, like any great racing mechanic, he came up with a few creative ways to stay ahead. History tells us that in racing, the guys who write the regulations are seldom as smart as the guys who interpret them. The rules were printed in black and white. Mechanical wizards like Dave saw only gray. It made for some wonderful chicanery. One of the best stories involves Mr. Tourigny doing some handy cut and paste metal work. Dave added a completely legal part number to a highly questionable intake manifold for a big NASCAR race. Bugsy went out and won it. When the inspectors tore down the engine, they carefully examined every internal part without bothering to take a second look at that deep breathing intake. After all, the legal part number was right there in plain sight. It was all part of the game, and Dave Tourigny played it as well as anybody. When Sonny Casella parked his equipment in the early 80s, we didn't see much of Dave for a while. Then Sonny's daughter Julie got mixed up with an up-and-coming driver named Mike Stefanik. Marriage followed. For the Casellas, this meant a new son-in-law and eventually grandchildren. For Tourigny, it meant more race cars to work on. Says Dave, once Michael showed up, it was like, here we go again. And boy, did they go. Behind the scenes is a sounding board for Mike and a reliable right arm for crew chief Sly Zabin. Dave was once again working on modifieds flying the number 15. Between 1986 and 1992, with Mike at the wheel, those cars won a Stafford Speedway title, 2 Spring Sizzlers, 2 Thompson 300s, a Pocono Race of Champions, and 2 NASCAR Modified Tour Championships. There were also 4 more trips to Victory Lane at Martinsville. Coupled with Bugsy's successes there, that made 9 Martinsville wins for Tourigny. No other New England mechanic has seen as much glory as at that historic Virginia track as Dave. The ironic part is Dave may be the least glorified wrench in New England history, at least among the winners. Through the 60s and 70s, the last era of truly home-built modifieds, the most successful builders, the guys on anyone's mechanical Mount Rushmore, were Lenny Moeller, Bob Judkins, Bob Johnson, and this man Dave Tourigny. The other three guys have been widely celebrated, mainly because their status as car owners for drivers like Eddie Flemke, Ronnie Bouchard, and Fred DeCero kept them in the limelight. Tourigny went largely unheralded. As Bugsy Stevens once told me, quote, "The guys in the pits, the other mechanics and drivers, they knew how smart Dave was. But outside of that small circle, he was an unsung hero. But you know, I'm sure that was fine with Dave. He didn't go for a lot of flash," said Bugsy. "He was just a quiet guy who stood off to the side minding his own business. We'd win a race, and when Sonny and I were on the podium accepting the trophies and having our pictures taken, Dave would be walking around that car, checking the tires, looking everything over," unquote. Today, Dave, we're going to turn that around. Today, Bugsy and Sonny and the rest of us are the ones kicking the tires, so to speak, and looking things over. It's your turn to stand in the spotlight, whether you want to or not. In the eyes of so many in this room, you have been a Hall of Famer for years. Today just makes it official. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming into the New England Auto Racers Hall of Fame, Mr. Dave Tourigny.
Thank you all very much. I really like to thank the members of the Hall of Fame for my induction. This is really great. None of this would have ever been possible for me without the support of the Casella family. They gave me everything I ever needed to build that car and to keep it running up front. And you know, nobody does this alone. You always need a good crew and a lot of help. And we've had that through the years with a lot of good people helping at the garage and at the track. Especially people like Gene Dow, who's always there to help. And you know, over the years, everybody asked me, you know, who was the favorite driver you worked with? I said, well, you worked with Leo Cleary, Freddie DeCero, Bugsy, Kenny Bouchard, and Mike Stefanik. They were all great. They were great to work with, and I couldn't pick one over the other. It was a lot of fun, and they were fun to work with. And again, I want to thank you all for the induction into the Hall of Fame. Thank you.
Well, once you step into the spotlight, you stay in that spotlight forever, because Dave Tourigny is a member of the New England Racing Hall of Fame.